In some games, the story is right there, waiting for you at the start line. Then there are those slow burn adventures, where you're not spoon-fed answers, but have to dig through layers of clues, environments, and hidden logs before the bigger picture comes together. If you're searching for games like that, this list is for you. Each of these titles will have you chasing the story, making discoveries, and ultimately blowing your mind with their carefully woven narratives. So, without further ado, let's get started. First up, we've got The Return of the Obra Dinn, a game that feels like you're unraveling the biggest, strangest puzzle box you've ever seen. From the moment you board that eerie ship, you're dropped into this deeply mysterious world where nothing's handed to you. You piece together the story through fragmented moments, using a magical pocket watch to leap back to the final seconds of the crew's lives. It's one of those games that doesn't spoon-feed you anything. You've got the crew manifest, a sketch, and the timeline. Everything else? That's on you to figure out. Now, what's wild about Obra Dinn is how it doesn't rush you. The case unfolds slowly, slow in the best way possible, because it lets you savor every clue. Lucas Pope, the game's creator, has this precision in his design. He knew exactly when to let you connect the dots yourself, instead of holding your hand through it. It's that same trust in the player that turned a moody narrative murder mystery into a masterpiece. Visually, Obra Dinn stands out too. That monochrome one-bit art grips you and brings that sense of uneasiness in a way that's low-key genius. The throwback visuals make the game feel unfamiliar while you piece together a worn-out tale of betrayal, mutiny, and strange sea creatures. It's as surreal as it is captivating, and you'll get lost in it for hours if you let yourself. Now, let's move on to Inscryption. This one's a different beast. Literally, part card battler, part escape room experience, and part unnerving mind trip. The thing about Inscryption is that it constantly messes with your expectations. You start by playing a simple card game against this creepy guy in a cabin, and just as you're getting the hang of that, bam, it completely changes. All those tiny details you can interact with outside the card game, turns out they're more significant than you thought. What Inscryption does so well is the way it keeps peeling back layers to reveal something darker underneath. Kinda like a fever dream where one moment you're forming strategies with your cards, and the next, you're solving puzzles in a rogue AI's digital purgatory. You don't just stumble upon the story, you're actively uncovering pieces of a much bigger, weirder narrative at your own pace. From the brain of Daniel Mullins, Inscryption walks that razor-thin line between eerie and fascinating. It's constantly flipping the script on you, so you're not just playing a card game. You're trying to figure out whatever this whole thing really is. And each time you think you know, the game pulls the rug from under you again with another twist. Like discovering a character was even in the game long before you even noticed. Next up is Outer Wilds. This game feels like you're falling headfirst into the unknown every single time you take off. It's got that same piecing together feel, but instead of slowly combing through a single location, you're exploring an entire solar system that resets every 22 minutes. Yeah, the time loop. It's a major part of both the gameplay and uncovering the story, which unravels like some cosmic detective diary entry by entry. The deeper you go, the more you realize just how connected everything is. What really stands out in Outer Wilds, though, is that sense of discovery. The one thing you can't recreate in too many games these days. You're learning things mainly because you're curious. Each time the loop resets, you come back knowing a little more and want to try something different. An attempt to fly into the sun? Yeah, you're probably not making that mistake twice. Mobius Digital, the indie team behind it, nailed it with how they use storytelling. There's no direct narration forcing a plot down your throat. Instead, it's more about the experience of figuring out this ancient mystery one piece at a time. The music ties everything together too, low-key guiding your emotions without being overpowering. And let's not forget that weird interplay between science and spirituality, which makes the whole thing feel like something both vast and strangely personal at once. Next on the list is Control. Now, Control isn't just your average action-adventure game. It's like being dropped right in the middle of an X-Files episode where nothing actually makes sense right away. From the moment you step into the Federal Bureau of Control, there's this overwhelming sense that you've just crossed into something bigger than yourself. You play as Jesse Faden, and of course, you're trying to figure out where your brother is. Sure, it's a simple enough starting point, but the deeper you go into the oldest house, the more you realize just how bizarre this story gets. This place is like a maze of paranormal activity, shifting rooms and documents filled with redacted lines. You ever try piecing together a story by reading someone's old conspiracy files? That's basically Control. You're figuring it all out at your own pace through environmental details, audio logs, and interviews with questionable subjects. And the weirdest thing? Control makes uncertainty feel almost comforting. You're not meant to grasp everything in one go. Remedy, the folks who gave us Alan Wake, are at it again with their signature way of mixing the surreal with the ordinary. And just like Alan Wake, there's this looming mystery barely hiding beneath the surface. And honestly, the physics in Control deserves some love too. Every object thrown at an enemy with telekinesis feels so satisfying. The game's destruction physics are easily one of the most fun things to play with. The combat's excellent, but some of the side missions, maybe not as polished. But again, it's just a minor gripe that I think you'll never notice at all if you're already too intrigued by the story. Let's continue with Zero Escape the Nonary games. In this game, you're trapped with 8 other people in a life-or-death survival puzzle that's like a twisted combination of Saw and an escape room. And the catch is that the more you solve these complex puzzles, the more you start to see that there's a deeper plot creeping through every conversation and interaction. This isn't a game that lets you connect the dots in one go either. Multiple playthroughs, multiple timelines, multiple endings. Yeah, you're gonna have to play it a few times to figure out the truth, because each storyline reveals a different layer of the narrative. Sitting through one ending isn't enough. There's no one truth. The real payoff happens when you've seen them all and filled in those blanks. It's an experience that slowly builds pieces of information, sometimes revealing small, seemingly unrelated facts that eventually become major revelations. Spike Chunsoft's knack for delivering these twisted, mind-bending narratives really gets flexed here. They did it before with Danganronpa, and here they do it again, but dial up the tension, especially in those moments of decision-making. The game does suffer a bit from lengthy dialogue sequences though. Some players might feel like they're wading through text instead of actual action, but the payoff for sticking around? Worth it. Another brilliant entry for this list is Pacific Drive. Imagine this. You're in a car, driving through this unnerving, desolate zone where reality itself is breaking down. Every drive deeper into the zone, you're either learning more or barely surviving, and sometimes both. What makes Pacific Drive unique is how your car becomes your lifeline. You're not just powering through a traditional story, you uncover bits of history, scientific experiments gone way wrong, as you make these runs, scavenging for answers, all while facing strange anomalies that want you very dead. You're not going to find cutscenes feeding you the story either. Instead, the history of this zone unfolds slowly through radio chatter, notes, and hints you pick up from the environment. Pacific Drive functions almost like a relationship between you and your car. You take care of it, repair it, mod it, and in return, it helps you push a little further into the unknown. Some comparisons could be made to survival roguelikes, except there's this environmental storytelling constantly urging you to figure out why this zone exists, and maybe find a way to stop it from collapsing. It feels like a Stalker game, but through a more personal perspective where you're always moving, and the car's your only real lifeline. There's a roughness to the controls sometimes, especially in tight squeezes where you're trying to escape, but the odd tension of knowing each drive counts is spot on. This is one of the brand new games released this year, and if you haven't played it yet, you definitely should. Alright, jumping into Horizon Zero Dawn, a game that slowly unfolds its story in such a satisfying, almost archaeological way. You play as Aloy trying to piece together 2 mysteries. How did humanity end up in this distant tribal future with robotic animals roaming around? And what's Aloy's connection to all of it? You climb ancient ruins, scan broken down machines, and read data logs. These small, seemingly monotonous tasks build up one significant narrative. There's no rush to fling you into the bigger reveal. Every new area, new machine part you scan, or piece of lore you discover adds a sliver of understanding to the larger picture. And slow burn narratives love doing that. You won't get the answers immediately. There's too much world building to soak in first. Guerrilla Games knocked it out of the park with the environment itself being a living tapestry of the past. You get to dig through the leftovers of old world tech that contribute to this multi-layered backstory gradually, like the mystery of why the Earth became dominated by machines. If there's one minor hiccup I've experienced, it's the combat. Sometimes it can feel a bit repetitive as you get deeper into the game, especially when you're mowing down hordes of the same types of machines and craving more story moments. However, this can be overlooked, especially when you're about to face new, challenging machines. Next on the list is Death Stranding, Hideo Kojima's wild and thoroughly unique experience. You're Sam Porter Bridges, a guy who delivers packages on foot across a dystopian America while trying to connect the fractured remnants of society, and somehow that's only scratching the surface. There's a whole load of metaphorical stuff tied up with life, death, and the afterlife. And this bizarre delivery job story slowly reveals a web of global catastrophe and cosmic forces. What makes this game such a fit for a list about piecing together the story? It's a slog, literally, considering you're spending chunks of time trekking over mountains or through rainstorms, delivering packages to survivors. During all this, lore seeps in slowly, emails, stories from NPCs, subtle world-building moments buried in delivering goods to people you'll never see. It's in the in-between spaces when you're out in the wilderness that you start to really discover the why behind it all. Each time you see a new place or hear a little more about how the world got so broken, another piece slots into place. Kojima, too, loves to play with pacing, and while some of his ideas verge on the strange and abstract, which honestly isn't surprising after Metal Gear Solid, there's a certain patience the game asks of you. However, due to the nature of the game, some players might feel like the game's long treks get tiring after the 100th delivery mission, but the quiet moments of introspection add layers that most games never touch. Up next, we have Subnautica and Subnautica Below Zero. These games are perfect for this list because you start on this alien planet with almost nothing in terms of clear narrative, and it's up to you to figure out what happened through exploration. The whole story of why your character crash landed and what came before your arrival slowly unravels as you scan animals, plants, and fossils, and read data logs left behind by other explorers. There's this eerie, empty feeling at the start, like something's off, something went horribly wrong here. And the more you dive into the depths, the more those eerie vibes start to make sense. What's great about Subnautica is that it doesn't hit you with forced dialogue or massive data dumps. Instead, you scan creatures, discover traces of ancient alien tech, and come across abandoned PDAs loaded with personal logs. It's like being a deep-sea detective, slowly stringing together the mystery of the planet's history, what led to it becoming this underwater wasteland full of strange life, and eventually, how to get off it. Each little discovery unfolds at its own pace, and the deeper you go, the more intense the answers get, especially once you start uncovering the role of the Kara virus. Subnautica Below Zero follows the same structure with a few tweaks. New biomes, new mysteries, and once again, the gameplay revolves around discovering pieces of history embedded in the environment. The tension of survival in both games is always present, though scanning sometimes gets repetitive when you're bent on not dying from lack of food and water. Still, the gradual reveals make the grind worth it. Coming in next is NieR Automata, a game that truly evolves its story in ways most can't. You start out thinking it's just a slick, fast-paced action RPG about human-created androids battling against some hostile machines. It rolls out like many action-heavy games at first, until you hit that first ending. Then the game just throws a curveball, showing you things from a previously unseen perspective, and that's when you realize there's so much more beneath the surface. What's unreal about NieR Automata is the level of emotional and philosophical depth it asks you to unpack, if you're willing to dig beneath the surface. The way different androids question existence, purpose, and free will. It subtly builds with each new playthrough, each new layer of the story. And we're not talking about basic replays. Every playthrough adds a new spin, revealing details you never would have realized on that first go. Honestly, part of the charm is how the game forces you to reevaluate everything. What you initially thought was a black and white conflict between good guys and bad robots. That slowly becomes incredibly gray by the end of the third run. You really can't connect the dots all at once. It's more like being in a slow waltz with tragedy as you piece together these broken truths. That said, sometimes the hack-and-slash combat can feel simple, especially when you want to dive deeper into the philosophical aspects. Now, with Spec Ops: The Line, we're still playing a shooter, right? But the key here is how Spec Ops weaponizes its slow reveal against you, the player. Lots of games throw you into Warzone settings, but this one? You're sent into Dubai following a cataclysmic sandstorm, and at first, things seem simple. And that is to find out what went wrong. Then things slowly start to unravel in ways that make you question your objectives, decision-making, and even what's right or necessary in the middle of chaos. The narrative in Spec Ops wasn't just there to set up firefights. It's meticulously designed to make you look back at each mission and wonder if you really did the best thing. Those choices you made, you realize they were never as straightforward as the game let you think at the start. The whole thing becomes a psychological peeling back of layers, revealing intense themes like trauma, guilt, and the dehumanizing effects of war. You can't just barrel through this game without paying attention to the tiny details that start popping up. Environmental cues, changes in dialogue, subtle shifts in music. Each of these things peels back layers of the moral ambiguity you're wrapped up in. I really find the story of the game engaging, but in terms of replayability, it lacks the traditional sense of unlocking new endings. However, the first playthrough is enough to leave a massive impact. Up next is Until Dawn, a teen horror interactive drama that really knows how to wear its influences, slasher films, supernatural thrillers, on its sleeve. At first, it's all about a group of teenagers trying to survive a night at a secluded mountain lodge during a snowstorm. You've got all the classic tropes, a group of friends, creepy locations, and, of course, some mysterious killer lurking about. But beyond that main plot of survival, there are two hidden stories waiting for you to piece together, and that's what makes the game work so well over multiple playthroughs. As you explore, you start finding clues about a group of miners who were trapped for weeks in a cave-in and somehow survived. That slow reveal of what really happened to them ties directly into dangers faced by the characters later on. It's not just backstory for world building, it becomes crucial to survival choices. And then the other mystery, the vanishing twins from a previous winter, adds another layer of tragedy and tension. These mysteries aren't handed to you on a silver platter either. It's up to you to gather the collectibles, documents, and hidden visual cues to really connect the dots on what led to the horrors presently unfolding. Sure, the gameplay's choices might be more about managing relationships and survival tactics, and yeah, sometimes those quick-time events can feel a bit basic, but the tension and mystery keep ramping up. It's like every step you take uncovers another cold piece of the puzzle buried deep in the snow. Let's not forget about What Remains of Edith Finch. It's one of those immersive narrative experiences where you spend a few hours in the shoes of Edith Finch, walking through this gorgeously weird, sprawling family home to uncover the stories of relatives long gone. This one is a proper slow burn. You're not bombarded with huge reveals, but instead you learn bits and pieces by exploring different rooms, reading letters, opening hidden spaces only accessible in the Finch's bizarre house filled with trapdoors and secret passageways. So, maybe you're wondering why this game is on this list. Well, it's because the fantastical ways the game tells each relative's story. You find artifacts, like a swing, a comic book, even cans of food, and suddenly you slip into these surreal, almost dreamlike minigames that recreate the final moments leading up to their deaths. Some are funny, others totally heart-wrenching, and you slowly piece together the history of this cursed family. Nothing's direct, and the way the mystery builds up, especially with that twist of magical realism, leaves you thinking long after the credits roll. Developer Giant Sparrow knows its way around unique storytelling. They previously worked on The Unfinished Swan, which also hid its story behind minimalism and creative gameplay. What Remains of Edith Finch does the same and is practically flawless at blending its interactive elements with narrative beats. Sure, as a walking simulator, some players may feel the gameplay is too hands-off, but the immersion and attention to detail make it unforgettable. Next, we've got Bioshock Infinite. Switching it up to Bioshock Infinite, where you're definitely not just running and gunning your way through a steampunk-inspired floating city. Sure, part of the appeal is Booker and Elizabeth's journey to unravel what's going on in Colombia, but as you piece it together, the game hands you audio logs, environmental clues, and even propaganda scattered around. Each new piece of the puzzle slowly fills in the backstory, whether it's delving into the politics of the city or the parallel universe concept that knocks the whole thing into mind-bending territory. By the time you're nearing that end, you've got most of the clues, a weird gut feeling things aren't quite adding up, but there's still a massive piece missing. It's not until that final stretch when you really start thinking you're getting the bigger picture. Then the whole thing flips on you, hard. When the lighthouse's scene hits and the multi-dimensional ties click into place, it's one of those moments that feels like a punch to the brain, a narrative payoff slow-cooked to perfection. On the tech side, Irrational Games really found a groove in crafting ambitious story-based shooters. Bioshock Infinite continues on the success of the first two Bioshock games, but here, the themes get way more existential, philosophical. There's also a critique buried within it, especially around American exceptionalism. But let's face it, some parts of combat feel overly padded by the end, which can slow down that narrative momentum a bit. But just forget about that because this game is totally worth it. Let's also give a shout out to Slay the Princess. This one is a wild trip. At first, the premise looks deceptively simple. Walk in, slay a princess, and save the world because she's gonna destroy it if you don't. Straightforward, right? Except the way the game slowly unravels into this twisted story filled with branching choices, psychological horror, and, oh boy, the writing just pulls you in deeper with each turn. You think it's one thing, then bam, it evolves. The game's strongest suit is its narrative premise, which constantly challenges your perception of both the princess and your role in this world. Every decision you make adds a layer of mystery and opens up more haunting, sometimes existential questions. And naturally, everything keeps leading up to a shocking conclusion that once again redefines what you thought you knew. It's kind of amazing how just a simple command, slay her or don't, spirals into a mind-bending roller coaster. And the art direction nails it, with creepy moments broken up by bouts of eerie beauty. You can feel the indie touch here, with bold thematic risks and a core focus on story-first gameplay, the eerie, beautifully crafted soundtrack, and some phenomenal voice acting. Let's be honest, they elevate the tone to another level. The pacing stays tight, though the simplicity of player input might feel limiting to those expecting more complex gameplay mechanics. However, with a game that draws you in with narrative beats, you're in it more for the story, and the mystery that refuses to stay solved. Up next is Inside. This is one of those games where silence and subtlety do most of the heavy lifting in telling the story. You start as a nameless boy running through a forest, and from then on, it's a relentless mood piece. You know something's seriously wrong with the world you're moving through, but you don't get clear answers up front. In fact, the more you traverse through eerie factories, submerged labs, and strange mind control setups, the less sense everything seems to make, at least until all those tiny clues start forming a bigger picture in the back of your brain. What stands out with Inside is how it doles out environmental storytelling. No dialogue, no text logs or notes to read. It's all done through the setting, the imagery, and the player's curiosity. Little by little, the more you push forward, the heavier the narrative gets. You start putting it together, the experiments, the twisted biotech, those strange beings lurking in the background. But that final shocking twist? Full-on nightmare fuel. Some players might finish it the first time and still walk away unsure of everything, which, given the tone, feels intentional. You can definitely see the DNA of Limbo in this game since both came from Playdead, but Inside feels more refined, more minimalistic in its execution. Some might say the movement and puzzle difficulty aren't challenging enough, but that tension-filled atmosphere is enough to keep you glued to the experience, unspooling the story at its own creepy pace. Next, there's The Sinking City, a game that really leans into detective noir with a hefty side of Lovecraftian horror. You step into the shoes of a private investigator who's trying to figure out why the city of Oakmont is being plagued by supernatural horrors. The kicker here is the city itself. It's not just a backdrop. As soon as you start wandering its flooded streets and crumbling buildings, the setting is the story, filled with clues, cryptic texts, and haunted whispers you pick up through investigation and your gradually unraveling sanity. By piecing together a swath of detailed case files and artifacts, you begin to dig deeper into its history and connect its bizarre phenomena to something darker and cosmic. That slow, investigative burn keeps everything feeling fresh. You're not just tossed into a checklist of objectives. The Sinking City makes you work for the story. The further you go, the more you're drawn into the cultish, nightmare-fueled world hiding beneath the city's surface, driven by its weird mix of character drama and horror. Where it really shines is how well it captures the decaying horror aesthetic, leaning into atmosphere and slow-brewing tension. Frogwares, known for their Sherlock Holmes series, kinda takes what they learned with those detective mechanics and morphs it into a horror mystery, but some technical bugs can mess with immersion. That said, if you're in it for lore, investigations, and an ominous sense of cosmic dread, it leaves you with more questions than answers. Rightfully so. Here's a game that's perfect for a cozy night in, Silent Hill 2 Remake. Nah, just kidding. But if you enjoy the first Silent Hill, then you definitely should play this remake. The original Silent Hill 2 was already a masterclass in how to unravel character trauma through gameplay, a story that you had to uncover bit by examining subtle details in the terrifying town of Silent Hill, and the remake stays true to that. You play as James Sunderland, a guy searching for his supposedly deceased wife after receiving a letter she shouldn't have been able to send. Simple premise, but the way it all unravels, way more complicated and emotionally charged than just a straightforward find the wife narrative. Now, in the remake, it's not just the story's deeper elements that come to life. Everything's designed to pull you in. From updated visuals to atmospheric sound design, you can almost feel the game's oppressive fog closing in on you. Every corner of Silent Hill is filled with clues about James's true inner conflict, most of which you'll only start to understand as you go, or more likely, during a replay when things start clicking. Each encounter, especially with Pyramid Head, adds layers to the story that'll leave you pondering what's real and what's just a manifestation of self-hatred and guilt. It's clear that the developer leaned into keeping the psychological horror intact, though some might worry about how their approach to past titles like Layers of Fear and The Medium has relied more heavily on overt horror tropes. Here's hoping they keep that delicate balance of tension, subtlety, and heart-wrenching storytelling that made the original a must-play while still giving us what we deserve today. Next up is Disco Elysium. Alright, let's talk about Disco Elysium, a game that feels like you've woken up in the middle of your own existential crisis, and someone handed you a magnifying glass for good measure. You're playing as a detective who's so deep in his destruction, he literally lost his memory while blackout drunk. And now, you've got a murder case to solve. Doesn't help that you're trying to unravel the mystery of who you even are at the same time. The game is perfect for those who enjoy slowly piecing together stories from nothing. The murder case? That's your main through line, sure, but simultaneously, you're left combing through discarded conversations, oddball dialogues, and flashes of subconscious thoughts just to figure out who the detective really was before he hit rock bottom. Every decision, every dialogue option you choose not only affects how people perceive you, but also changes what types of thoughts and reflections you start wrestling with. It's the thought cabinet and how you actively choose which voices in your head to listen to that makes Disco Elysium such a unique experience. You don't even need to be good at detective work to uncover the layers of who you are. What chaos ensues still feeds the story brilliantly. Despite this, fans of traditional RPG combat might feel a bit held back since Disco Elysium is all about conversation and psychology. But once you embrace that aspect, you're in for an unforgettable mental journey. Let's finally wrap this list with Signalis. At first glance, you might be reminded of classic Silent Hill or Resident Evil games, especially with its survival horror mechanics and underlying tension. But this one digs a little deeper into psychological horror territory while weaving together a fragmented story that keeps you guessing all the way up until its ending, which, by the way, hits that perfect blend of closure with enough open-endedness to keep you thinking long after. This game doesn't just hand you pieces of the narrative on a silver platter. It's all in the environmental clues, the dreamlike sequences, and those ominous data logs spread around. You're left reading cryptic messages, trying to figure out the connection between the protagonist, an android named Elster, and a missing woman she's seeking. The game is set in a dystopian future, but instead of feeding you direct context, it lets you uncover the lore through exploring derelict facilities, messed up dream sequences, and odd memories. The deeper in you go, the more you realize not everything is as clear-cut as it seems, and that mystery keeps you driven. Where this game really excels is its use of puzzles to unlock more of the story. It's not just figuring out how to move forward, but also interpreting clues and being cautious about reading between the lines to catch the true narrative threads. And with 3 main endings plus a secret one buried in there, it calls for multiple playthroughs. The feeling of unease builds beautifully, though controlling limited inventory space midway through can get a bit tedious, especially with constant backtracking. But that was just a minor concern, and it will not affect your overall experience of the game. Before we end, I also would like to mention Returnal. This is another slow burn story, but Returnal handles it differently, through the lens of a roguelike. You're playing as Celine, an astronaut stranded on the hostile alien planet Atropos. Every time she dies, she wakes back up, crash-landed at the same point on the planet, with her memory slowly twisting, sliding, falling apart. And gradually, through repeated deaths and exploration, you start piecing together not only what happened on this planet, but cracks in Celine's own psyche begin unraveling. What's fascinating is how Returnal blends its roguelike mechanics with storytelling. Progress isn't linear, but every new run, no matter how similar, gifts you fragmented details. You find audio logs from past versions of yourself, uncover cryptic visions of a house that shouldn't exist on an alien planet, and face off against these incredibly intimidating alien species. All of it at first, a giant jumble of science fiction mystery. It takes multiple cycles and near obsessive attention to detail to eventually start seeing how Celine's past and present tie into the deeper mystery of why she's marooned. And for players willing to push through the high-octane combat, the emotional payoff is solid. Housemarque's focus on tight gameplay paired with these existential psychological layers makes for a truly unique roguelike experience. And yeah, the combat can be brutal. By the third biome, the difficulty spike catches you off guard, but the fluid movement and gunplay keep you coming back for just one more run. Balancing the challenge of constant death and the piecemeal narrative is tricky though. Some might feel just when they're really connecting the dots, they're dragged back to the start again, but that's part of the beauty. It's all about persistence, both in the story and the combat. And that's it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the list, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more content like this.